The permutation generator exercise is a little bit challenging, I think mostly because it's not necessarily easy to interpret what is being asked for. We're used to working with random number generators, so in our mind it's like, well, why can't I just create an array, use a random number generator to randomly fill it in? And they're saying that a better way, instead of just relying solely on the random number generator, which is not truly random, it simulates randomness. It comes as close as a computer can to simulating randomness, but it's based on a seed number, which usually is the clock time of when you generate the first random object. And that's not really random in theory. There's lots of discussion about that if you want to Google it. So one of the points of this exercise is, why don't we fill an array with the numbers 1 to 10 and then create a second array and use a random number to go out and grab an use a random number to give me the index value for a location in the array that I filled with the numbers 1 to 10. And then, so I randomly generate a 3. Well, then I go to the item in the first array that's at the index number of 3, which would technically be the fourth item since we start counting with 0. And let me grab that number and put it into the first location in my new array. And so in their mind, we're randomly generating numbers, but then we're also going to an array that we've already created and getting numbers out of that. And that is simulating better randomness than just the random number generator alone. So I'm not going to debate that. There's lots of information on the internet on that. But the idea of this exercise is it gives us a good way to do two arrays and then to practice taking a value from one, putting it in another, and then passing an array back to main. So in the past we said that a method could return one value, a single int, double char, a string, or boolean, back to main. Well, an array is a single unit. It contains multiple items within it, but it is a single unit. So we can now pass an array back to main or from main to the class file. So we can pass multiple values in the sense if we do it through an array, and that's the other part of this exercise. So they asked you to create a class called PermutationGenerator, and when I do this class, there's a couple different ways you can do it. I make two instance variable arrays, so I do two int arrays. I call one an array and one perm array for permutation array. This is going to be the empty one that I fill up with numbers from the first one using this random number generator to generate random index numbers for me. In theory, this probably doesn't need to be an instance variable. It could be declared in the method. And then for my constructor, I really don't need to send it anything. All I want the constructor to do is to put the numbers 1 to 10 in this first array, and that's the array I'm going to grab the values from randomly to put into the permutation array, which is just empty at this point. And probably what I really should do, technically I probably should come in here and I probably should maybe have a for loop where I just initialize all the values in perm array to 0, perm array sub I equals 0. That's probably a little more responsible thing for me to do as a programmer in the constructor, is to go ahead and make absolutely certain that every value in the array is defaulted to 0. Then I come in and I do that other method they asked for called next permutation, and it returns an int array. So notice I put int empty brackets here, and that lets me pass the whole array back to my main method. So now what I'm going to do is, and this is where it gets a little tricky, I'm going to write a for loop so that I can go through perm array item by item, element by element, and I can fill it in with numbers. So I'm going to start at perm array sub 0 or index 0. I'm going to grab a number randomly out of the an array, and then I'm going to go to the next one and the next one. I'm going to keep grabbing numbers randomly from the first array that I called an array. So here I'm getting a random number. This is going to become the index number of the location where I'm going to go to an array to grab the actual value out. Now what I like to do with this is once I grab a number out so I don't get duplicates, I don't grab the same number twice, what I like to do, since my values are supposed to be 1 to 10, when I grab a value out of a location and move it into that or copy it into that perm array, I go ahead and put a 0 in there so that if I generate that index number again, I know I've used it, and I can say keep generating new index numbers until you get one that you haven't used. So in other words, I generate a random number between 0 and 9, right, because I'm using a 10 here, which works because my array index numbers go from 0 to 9 in a 10 item array. So I'm going to generate a number from 0 to 9. As long as whatever number is in the an array, the original array with the numbers 1 to 10 in it, at that location is equal to 0, I've used that number. I need to generate another number and another and another until I find an element. I get a random number that goes to an element that I have not used. So it will have something other than a 0 in it. So as long as I'm getting back a 0 when I test the value in the an array, the original array, I know I've used the number at that location. I need to keep generating random numbers for my index number until I find one where it's not a 0 in an array. So let's walk through a scenario. So I get the number 1 back here. So in an array 1, I would have the number 1 because I've got the number 0 to 10 in there. Sorry, I would not do that. I'm wrong on that. So an array sub 0 would have a 1. An array with an index number of 2 would have a 2. Maybe, sorry, can't think. 1 would have a 2, and so on, right? Because I put the numbers 1 to 10 in that original array. So here I generate the number 2. Now that is going to be my index number. So I go to an array sub 2, index number 2 here, just as if I had typed a 2, and I check and that value is 3, means I haven't used it yet. So since an array with a 3 index number is not equal to 0, I don't execute the loop. I come down here and I take that value, I'm sorry, my index number was 2, and I take the 3 and I put that into the 0 element of perm array. So perm array's first element has a 3 in it. Then I set this one equal to 0. Now I come back in. My I value is 1. I'm going to fill in the second value in perm array. So I generate a random number, and say this time I generate another 2. Well, I set this to 0 before. So I'll go out and say an array sub 2. Does that equal a 0? Yes, it does. I've used it before. Okay, let me generate a different random number. So now I get a 1. So then I say perm array sub 1, because my I is on 1, equals the value at an array sub 1, which is 2. Okay, so I know that's tricky. You got to kind of think about it and walk through it. But that's really what they're asking you to do in this one. Create one array with the numbers 1 to 10. Create a second array. Use a random number to simulate a random index number. Go to the first array, to that location, that index number, and pull the value out and store it in perm array. Now this would probably be much better with an array list, and I'll try to do an example of that next week for this one, because I could actually delete, once I generate the random number and I use that value, I could actually delete it out of the array list, and that would be better than having to go through the hoops of faking it out with a 0. So give this one a try and let me know if you have any questions.